I now invite our keynote speaker, Professor Rainer Steurer, who is political scientist at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. So, thank you. Richard, your presentation, and then... And I think you should be able to use that thing, but yes. If it's really possible, this doesn't stretch any further. Yeah. I'll see there.
So, good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this final conference. I'm glad to be here, in particular since we had the first winter spell in Austria, and I came here yesterday and it was continuing of summer. It was quite nice. As Julia mentioned, I'm a political scientist, so you probably expect me to talk about definitions, concepts, typologies, and I try to fulfill that expectation, although I hope in kind of an entertaining way. I want to do it as kind of trip through contemporary governance with a map that you need for a trip, and of course with a little bit of sightseeing to make it more interesting than it is in most scientific papers. Okay, I think my voice is loud. So, governance is the first term that's quite difficult here already in the heading. Let's start out with an easier term. That's government, and it's quite easy to do sightseeing with regard to government. Is somebody in the audience who recognizes all three pictures? Please raise your hand. It is? Yeah, absolutely. But I asked for somebody who knows the other two as well. Do you have a guess for the other two pictures? It's the parliament in Vienna. Looking Greece, but not as bankrupt as Greece. And the one at the top? That's the European Parliament. So,
I want something.
No. So we all do government sightseeing sometimes, and these are representative buildings, all nice to look at. But the problem is that they are not as powerful as they used to be. You know, globalized economy, multinational companies moving around. So we have to shrink them. And that brings us to governance sightseeing. Now the problem with governance is, what can you look at? What's the site that stands for governance? That's a tricky question, and it's related to the following. Who is in charge when it comes to governance? Who does governance? Who's responsible for governance? Of course, we have governments, but they're only part of governance. So that's the place where I think a map is useful. A map that kind of organizes the very messy and complex field of governance. And the first part of that map is a cycle representing government. That's of course only at best a third of the story. The other parts of the story are, as you may guess, businesses. They play a role in contemporary governance, and when I say governance, I mean steering society, regulating society, determining where society should go to. And then, who can guess what the third cycle may be? Society, civil society, NGOs, things like that. So this kind of is the map for governance. And governance is everything that plays out within these three circles. That's of course a very general statement. And CSR and CSR policies are part of this governance. Now the question is, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so, how can we fit CSR policies and CSR into this governance map? How does it relate to other forms of regulation? And that's where a little bit of sightseeing comes into play, trading society. That's what we've had for a couple of years, and now it's decreasing because governments struggle with several complex environmental issues. If we take the sightseeing beyond these representative buildings, it gets quite interesting. The interesting thing is what's going on behind those walls. And one quite interesting site for hard regulation is this one, which is not that good. So can somebody recognize what this is related to hard regulation? How can this illustrate hard regulation? It's really hard to tell, the quality isn't that good. It's a filter or a catalytic converter, and it was mandated by law to put into every car, and it solved the acid rain or the Waldsterben problem done through hard regulation. Of course, you also needed technological innovation, things like that. But then governments said, so we're going to do this. Every car has to use this kind of filter. This is hard regulation. You have to do it. You have no choice. And it's, of course, very effective. We solved a major problem. Waldsterben, the problem didn't disappear out of nothing. It was solved politically. What else is within this governance map? Well, since we are interested in CSR, let's move on to the business circle. And there we have of course, business self-regulation. And that's when businesses specify rules, self-monitor the rules, and self-enforce the rules. That means more or less they're doing regulation on their own terms. And of course you can distinguish different types of business self-regulation. I want to talk about 2 or 3. First, you can do this at an industry level, like the whole industry is agreeing certain standards, certain codes. And a good example for that is, and there we are back at sightseeing, the Cement Sustainability Initiative. It's more than about writing reports, CSR reports. It's about a pledge reducing CO2 emissions in cement production. And it actually produced CO2 reductions. This figure tells you that they reduced the industry emissions of CO2 from 1990 to 2012 by around 16%. Of course, there may be technological innovation behind this and things that would have happened anyway, but still, it is what I would call a CSR success story, in particular because it produced better reductions than the EU emission trading system. EU emission trading, you know what that is. It's hard regulation, setting up a market for CO2 emissions, and it failed completely. So you have an example of hard regulation failing, an example of CSR producing at least something. These emission reductions go way beyond the reductions EU emission trading system has achieved. So you can't really say hard regulation is better than CSR. It really depends how it's designed, how it's working and functioning. Next, we have CSR at the firm level, self-regulation at the firm level. And in the literature, you see most often at least 3 types of CSR at the firm level. That's philanthropy, writing checks, donating money to cultural or sports events. Then you have CSR integration. That means that you integrate environmental concerns into your business as usual. In this case, it's about a retail chain making its stores as green as possible through efficient lighting, e-mobility, solar panels on the roof, and so on. So they integrate CSR into what they do anyway. And then, of course, the highest, most ambitious form of CSR is CSR innovation, where you try to produce a new product that takes environmental considerations into account. And one of the most famous examples is probably the hybrid car. And as always with CSR, you of course have economic considerations in your back, like this is going to be the future of mobility, but still you need some environmental concern to do all this. And as far as I know, you've worked on CSR innovations in your project as well, so you're quite familiar with this kind of CSR. So that's about it for business self-regulation. These are the most important forms of governance here. What's going on in civil society? Who can guess what civil society does in terms of governance. There's one quite spectacular form of civil society activity going on sometimes. Pressure, exactly. That's one of the two forms. I call it less formalized pressuring businesses, putting them under pressure through campaigns, calling on consumers, boycotting certain companies. But that's not the whole story. They also formulate formal standards, and examples for that are RAGMARK or the Ceres principle, and they hope that companies take on those standards on a voluntary basis. And these standards are written by NGOs only. They are not cooperating with businesses, so it's civil regulation done by civil society alone. Of course, the most attractive sightseeing is when it comes to pressuring companies, and probably the most interesting sight happened, I think, more than 20 years ago in the North Sea, when Shell got under pressure from Greenpeace not to sink an oil platform called the Brent Spar. Greenpeace called on consumers boycotted Shell, and Shell had all the legal requirements for sinking that platform in the sea. Finally, they decided not to sink it because public pressure through society became so big that it was better for them to withdraw and say, well, yeah, we bring it to a fjord in Norway, dismantle it there, clean and everything, although they had all the legal requirements for sinking it. That's really kind of highlight for civil regulation. It demonstrates you that civil society can really put big companies, even big companies, under pressure. It doesn't work always. There are many examples where NGOs try to pressure companies, but they don't get far because they don't get media attention or whatever. Now, what else shapes CSR? As you see, there are overlapping areas between the circles, and of course they can't be empty. Sometimes different actors, like businesses and NGOs, go into partnerships, do something together, and there you find probably the most prominent examples of governance in terms of certification schemes or in terms of private partnerships. Partnerships between NGOs and businesses. One of the first green refrigerators was developed by Greenpeace and an electronic appliance manufacturer, and then that machine spread throughout the market, so that was quite a powerful kind of partnership. Again, when it comes to sightseeing, it's easier to look at certification schemes, and the most popular examples are, of course, these: the Marine Stewardship Council and the Forest Stewardship Council. For this kind of sightseeing, it's enough to go to the supermarket. You find them on many products, meanwhile, and it's co-regulation because these schemes are not developed by NGOs alone, but in cooperation with businesses. The Marine Stewardship Council, I think, evolved out of a partnership between an environmental NGO and Unilever, one of the biggest fish suppliers on Earth. And then it got more and more independent, but still industry plays a role in how the label works, how the rules are enforced. So, what is left up there is of interest for us, because that's the area where CSR policies, or as you can also call it, soft regulation, takes place. Soft regulation means that governments appeal to businesses, do certain things. It's not mandatory. It's very different to introducing catalytic converters by law, and you'll see how it works. And of course, the idea is that governments appeal to businesses, but also support or influence NGOs to do something for sustainable development or CSR. What about the overlapping areas in here? Well, the orange circle demonstrates where CSR takes place. CSR is everything that takes place within the business circle. And then the overlapping areas in between are both CSR policies from the perspective of governments, because they go into partnerships or agreements with industry. And for businesses, that's CSR. They do it voluntarily, and so it depends from where you look at it, it's CSR or CSR policies. It's both. And that's what we want to look at, CSR policies. Now you see how our topic fits into the messy concept of governance. It's one small but quite important part, meanwhile, that tells you how different actors in society try to move towards sustainable development. So keep this map in mind when I talk about CSR policies now, and let's see how governments can promote CSR. And as I've seen in your brochure, this resembles quite to 2/3, I think, the COGITA matrix. On the one hand, you have instruments, that's your orange bubble, and on the other hand, you have themes. And the instruments are more or less identical with the instruments you have in the brochure. And I assume this is no coincidence. Somebody must have read my papers, so I'm glad to see that my work sometimes finds readers and is of interest to the world, so to say. Now the instruments, I don't have to say much about them because you're all familiar with them. They are the standard repertoire of policy making. Quite new for CSR is probably partnering instruments. Those are located in these overlapping areas. And hybrid instruments are those that do more things at once, like action plans to try to raise awareness, to try to orchestrate different instruments, things like that. And the themes are, of course, a momentary picture of what I see as relevant right now in terms of CSR policies. So you can do CSR policies on raising awareness or building capacities. You can work on disclosure and transparency. You also have these themes in your brochure. Then you could probably list supply chains, although I would see them under raising awareness. And quite important is, I think, fostering SRI, socially responsible investment, and one of the core interests for you, lead by example. And that is more than public procurement. It's also applying social responsible investment in the public sphere. As far as governments have money to invest, they could do it in a social responsible way, and governments still have money to invest, like pension funds and so on. And we are talking about a lot of money there. So lead by example goes beyond public procurement. Don't forget this part. It goes even beyond SRI. Governments could produce something like OSR or CSR reports demonstrating what they've done on certain issues. They could apply environmental management schemes in the ministries, making the ministries greener and so on. I could fill every single cell here now, and you would be all dead at the end of my talk, so that's not what I'm going to do. I want to highlight some of the things that go on in these cells. If you want to read about every single cell, there's a paper you could read, and you find more information on these things. Of course, first, you can, for example, improve transparency by requiring CSR reporting. Now, in a strict sense, you could say, well, when a law requires CSR reporting, how can that be CSR policies? Because CSR policies are soft regulation, not mandatory. Most of these laws are soft. The law says companies have to write these reports, but there is no enforcement foreseen. There are no sanctions, and the law does not specify how these reports should look like. So it's soft regulation. It's more a recommendation, please write these reports, and you won't get punished for just writing 2 pages. It's soft regulation. More interesting would be to see government regulation on private labels. In Austria, at least, we have sometimes really a hard time in figuring out what a label stands for, because sometimes supermarket chains create their own labels and you don't know, is it a real organic food label or is it something in between? There is need for government regulation on private labels so that consumers are not confused. Because the key point with labels is they should make products or the market more transparent. Now, if you have 10, 20 labels, you get the opposite. You get confusion, no transparency at all. So there would be a role for governments to take care of transparency, so that doesn't get lost. On the lead by example side, we of course need laws that enable sustainable public procurement, and that's in place all over Europe for a couple of years now. It was a concern before that, because procurers said, well, how can we discriminate on social and environmental issues? It's done. We have those laws. An very powerful economic instrument in terms of raising awareness would be to support NGOs or civil co-regulation, and that brings us to these two arrows. When we talk about CSR policies, we often think about what can governments do to promote self-regulation. That's only part of the story. Please don't forget these two arrows. It means that governments should also support NGOs who can then pressure companies or work together with them. And NGOs often lack resources, so government support for them is very often crucial, and therefore I include supporting NGOs into CSR policies, because that also drives CSR at the end. SRI tax incentives, for example, having no capital tax on responsible investment would be a policy to foster SRI, social responsible investment. And you find that in some countries. I think Britain has some kind of scheme that promotes SRI, but it could be much more widespread. And I think it would push the SRI market, and it probably would even change the thinking of investments if there were more government incentives into that direction. Informational instruments are usually the weakest ones. You know, it's about informing, putting out guidelines, codes of conduct, but we should not underestimate them, because in CSR policies, it's very often about convincing others, promoting some things, and you could, as a government, you could put out guidelines for CSR reports, or you could produce information, guidelines, and so on sustainable public procurement, because procurers, full-time procurers, are rarely aware of social and environmental issues, so you need to raise awareness for this topic. An interesting partnering instrument, and in this field the Dutch are leading around the world, are negotiated agreements where governments sit down together with businesses and negotiate some kind of deal. In other countries they don't work that well. You really need to have a kind of tradition in doing this. And from the Dutch you can learn how it can work. In other countries you can see how it fails, so it's a very tricky instrument. And these are, by the way, in the overlapping areas. Negotiated agreements are co-regulation where governments sit down together with businesses. So last not least, we have hybrid instruments that combine different other things. And I put labels into this box because on the one hand they inform consumers, on the other hand they present an economic incentive for companies because they expect a market niche, whatever. And labels are really a very powerful instrument. In political science we even say it's the third big wave of policy instruments that we are dealing with now. The first wave were laws in the 60s and 70s. Everything was done with laws. Then the second wave of instruments were economic ones, like CO2 taxes, emission trading. And now the third wave of instruments is labels, or regulation by information, as we could also call it. But you have to be careful. For example, the energy label mandated by the EU is not CSR policy. That's something you have to do. You have to put an energy label on your product. Therefore, it's traditional policy making, very close to these kinds of labels. These are voluntary. I'm thinking about organic food labels, things like that. Regulated by government with strict rules. You have to comply with, but you don't have to use the label. If you don't want to, you can ignore it. And therefore, it's still a soft regulation, voluntary. Now we get a kind of picture of what government can do to promote CSR, and there would be a lot more to say if we try to fill every cell. What is common, and where are the differences between these instruments? But they all have in common that they represent soft regulation. They're non-binding, voluntary, they're more recommendations and incentives than mandatory. But this doesn't mean that these instruments are all limited in scope, how you apply these instruments. You can apply them passively, like doing the necessary, or you can really go proactively into an instrument and put a lot of money, for example, into incentives. And there is really a big difference you can make. If you look at the CSR policies at the EU level, you see very proactive policy at the early 2000s under the Prodi Commission. And then the Commission took it all back and left it to the businesses. So they changed from a proactive to a very passive approach. And you can see that in many countries. So although CSR policies are soft, it's a normal policy field. You could go after it in a harder or a proactive way, or you can do it in a passive way. It's not that different to climate policy making or water. And of course you find good and bad practices for every instrument. I mean, an information campaign or a brochure can be done in a bad way, and it can be done in a good way and have a great impact. And that applies for every single instrument. By the way, in every form of regulation, I mentioned the EU emission trading, which is supposed to be a strong instrument with strong economic incentives. It's not. So it really depends on how it's designed, how it's used. And what are the most promising things governments can do? And this is really a subjective picture from my point of view. I think in terms of legal instruments, it would be really necessary to regulate private labels, to secure transparency on the marketplace. That would be much more important than having laws for CSR reports, which no consumer reads. I mean, those are probably for the company itself and for investors, certainly not for consumers. But consumers are a major driving force behind CSR, so it would be better to pay attention to labels. Supporting NGOs is, I think, a very credible way to promote CSR, because they are one of the drivers behind CSR. Product labels issued by governments are again an important theme, and we see some things going on there. And then, of course, leading by example is throughout very important, I think. I mean, what sense does it make to write into strategies that society should be sustainable, businesses should do more, and then governments themselves do nothing or close to nothing? So they should really go ahead, lead by example, be a role model, and say, look how we do it. Now you can try to copy us, although you may not reach us or something like that. But failing on that side is really not a good signal for the rest of society. And unfortunately, the instruments you see in here, like laws enabling sustainable public procurement, information, guidelines, things like that, they won't be enough. It's quite hard to walk the talk, as we know probably from some personal experiences. So what is required beyond this can be illustrated with another sightseeing tour. And since I'm from Vienna, I chose Vienna. Probably some of you know ÖkoKauf. Supposedly a quite successful program in sustainable public procurement in the city of Vienna. And what you see there is, of course, you need legal clarity, you need an action plan that kind of orchestrates the whole thing. You need a lot of information material, guidelines, even trainings, because public procurers don't care about these things, and it's not enough to put a brochure on the table. They won't read it. You really have to go there and train them. Budgets, of course, are sometimes important, because particularly when you procure organic food, it costs more than normal food. So these are quasi the basics for sustainable public procurement. And beyond that, and I think that tells you the ÖkoKauf example very well, you need leadership, somebody who is really engaged, possibly from the highest political level, and you need lighthouse projects that kind of show the potential of the whole thing, And ideal would be to have a lighthouse project that saves money. That's possible. For example, if you change the detergents used to cleaning hospitals, the environmental friendly ones are often the cheaper ones. If you can demonstrate that, that may make an impact. But beyond that, you need awareness campaigns and sometimes even break habits, like convincing people personally that this would be a good way to go about it. So it's certainly not enough to put an instrument on the table and wait for something to happen. Sometimes you have to go after them personally and do a lot of convincing. And finally, you could of course have elaborate project criteria and databases that help procurers choose the right products, but that requires that they are already aware of the whole thing and buy into it. So this was my last stop on the sightseeing trip, and as I've read in the program, there's a lot more sightseeing coming up. After me, we will hear from the city of Malmö. Unfortunately not, that's cancelled. But we will hear from Birmingham City how to do it. We will hear from Flanders how to do it. And we will hear from Emilia-Romagna. So sightseeing continues, and it brings us all across Europe. For me, that's it. Thank you very much. If you're interested in reading the papers and you can't access them, write me an email and I'll send you a copy. And there you find much more of those things I've talked about, the circles and the many cells in the table. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah.
While
I'm
happy to answer whatever is on your mind.
I'm actually. I was actually very happy to see how Professor Steurer reminded us that we should, as public authority, be walking the talk or be leading by experience, or as somebody said at the very, very first preparation meeting that we had in Brussels when we were thinking about COGITA, how we should put our own houses in order before demanding specific CSR behaviors on the part of enterprises. I think this overall issue of public procurement that we will deal with in the second part of the morning is probably one of the best, most effective ways to lead by example, to provide opportunities to companies to be CSR consistent and also to make good use of the little money that public authorities have available nowadays.